Welcome, and thank you very much, all of you, for joining us to today's webinar. My name is Christina Moberg. I'm the president of EASAC, European Academy Science Advisory Council, which is an association of the National Academies of Science in the EU member states, plus Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. Through EASAC, the academies, and which means then also many of the best scientists in Europe, work together to provide independent expert policy advice, mainly within the three areas, which are energy, environment, and the biosciences, for policymakers within the EU institutions and also within the different member states. So EASAC, together with our partner European Academy networks, ALLEA and FEAM, have organized this webinar today to discuss our joint consensus report, which was published last month, on the issues of international sharing of personal health data for research. Our three academy networks, together we span multiple disciplines and we have a wide range of interests. But we share an important interest in making most use of all the data. This broad interest covers many issues for collecting, validating, curating, sharing, and using data from different sources. Today, we are focusing on our recent project, which addresses mutual interest relating to the sharing of personal health data for research in the public sector. The history of EASAC and FEAM working together on the mutual interest to raise the importance of these issues actually goes back to the first discussions on the drafting of the EU General Data Protection Regulation already before 2014. Today we have an excellent program with key presentations from the project working group and discussions with diverse panelists who I'm sure will stimulate a wide discussion on the key priorities, which are important to all of us, actually. I will leave the introductions of the presenters and panelists to my colleagues, the presidents of ALLEA and FEAM. But let me emphasize what will be the theme throughout our webinar. We must ensure that our mechanisms for sharing personal data on health for research in the public sector are safe and efficacious and must, of course, take into account the privacy concerns. Currently, there are three major impediments to sharing data from the EU European Economic Area with countries outside. Sharing is important for researchers, but also actually vitally important for all of us in providing and using knowledge for improving lives, for reducing health inequalities, and to benefit society in Europe as well as worldwide. The appropriate sharing of health data internationally is essential if health research and care are to progress. As you will hear during this webinar, I think that we have all been affected in our daily lives by the opportunities and challenges for sharing data during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are at serious risk of losing the capacity to generate value for Europe by research collaboration with other countries outside the EU EEA. And the current problems will affect the EU's leadership position in health research. This is actually the first tripartite project between EASAC, FEAM, and ALLEA. We came together because we all recognize the importance and urgency of the problems we face and the necessity for using all our expertises to agree solutions. And I want to thank all those who were involved in the project and also in organizing today's webinar for their commitment and their clarity in assessing complex issues. And particularly, I thank my colleagues, the presidents of ALLEA and FEAM, for their collegiality and enthusiasm in our common purpose. And I hope that today's webinar will help to drive momentum to implement workable solutions. I can assure you that our academies will actively pursue all opportunities to inform discussion and support action by policymakers. We welcome feedback from all of you participating today to help us in doing this. Let me end by quoting from the preface of the report of the 3 presidents of the Academy networks, like this. The problems for public sector researchers have been neglected by many policymakers. This neglect must be corrected rapidly because the problem affects patients and all citizens who are the beneficiaries of public sector health research. It is now my pleasure to hand over to the President of FEAM, Professor George Griffin, who will briefly introduce the network. So, George, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Christina. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today to really look at the work that's been carried out over the past year. And as you say, this is such an important area, international collaboration in terms of health and medicine. And we forget the legalities sometimes of how these data are exchanged. And I must say, one of the things I learned in terms of being at the meetings was the fact that the lawyers need clarity of exactly what health data is, and they want to help. They want to help and smooth data transfer out in a way which is private, which is anonymized, and which is to everyone's benefit. And everyone here knows the sorts of areas that we're talking about. Antimicrobial resistance, a worldwide challenge, cancer registries to know just what's going on in different countries with cancer and its treatment, just to mention 2. And there are many, many others as we will hear about during the meeting. So it's a great pleasure to be here. As FEAM president, I have just a very few days left before I become a late president and become a member of the board. So it's a great pleasure to finish on this very, very high note. FEAM, or FEAM, as I'm getting now educated to call it, is a group of 23 academies throughout Europe, from the UK in the west, right through to Romania in the east. We are very collegiate, and one of the things that I've done during my presidency is to say that health actually is a continuum. And so in addition to medical academies, we have incorporated veterinary academies and academies of pharmacy and pharmacology to reflect this continuum. And I'm very pleased to say that is working well. So at that point, I'll hand over to Antonio, a very favorite colleague of mine on SAPIA, as you may hear a little bit about that as well. And he will then introduce the idea of the project and the presentations from Rosa and Giske. Antonio.
Thank you very much, dear George, and thank you, dear Christina, for your introduction and for opening this online discussion event. I am Antonio Loprieno. I am the president of ALLEA, as just mentioned, on whose behalf I would also like to warmly welcome you as speakers, panelists, or participants. First of all, let me also start by thanking particularly, as my colleagues have done, the 2 networks, their representatives, and also the younger colleagues, scientists who have worked at making this the success it is. Our own network, ALLEA, consists of about 60 academies from 40 countries all over Europe, and to a large extent, the same institutions that have been evoked by the two colleagues who have preceded me and who are gathered in these more disciplinary orientations. Our own perspective, since our foundation has rather been the cross-disciplinary perspective, trying to promote science as a global public good and facilitating scientific collaboration among countries and across disciplines. And in this era of digital transformation, and this is what our project in particular refers to, we are as network, but also as individual scientists and scholars, particularly interested in the opportunities and challenges that come with a collection and with sharing and analyzing data in our increasingly digital world. In this perspective, I'm very proud that our three networks have joined forces to produce this report on international health data transfer that we are about to discuss today. Now, the pace and scale of these processes in this area have, as we all know, increased dramatically over the last 10 to 20 years as a result of both progress in hardware and the development of artificial intelligence as an autonomous branch of digital studies and computer science and informatics in general. And the central questions that to the theme of data governance, as it were, that are of interest for us as network and to the academies we represent are, let's say, two forms of compromise, if you will, or of balance that we need to reach in our contemporary world. And one of these balances is the balance between open science, which is a good that we all long for, and that is one of the major progresses for modern science in general, but also on the other hand, the need to protect the individual researchers and scientists' property right of their own research. And that we have here a kind of balance that needs to be particularly so considered. And the second great balance that we need to reach, and that concerns perhaps even more today's topic, is the diffusion and the distribution and the development of scientific data, especially in the medical sector, in health sciences, on the one hand, and of course, the privacy of one's own personal data in this area, which is, so in our civilization, also an important good that we should not disregard or neglect. So these are issues that have a scientific basis, but also have implications of juridical, social, cultural, ethical nature that also call for a cross-disciplinary analysis of this complex phenomenon. So the multidisciplinary nature of our organizations allows us to take a better look at questions of data governance from many different so complementary angles. Now, this is a topic that, as George and Christina just mentioned, also reaches out to the entire European intellectual and scientific community. And in fact, one of the notable outcomes of our activities in the area of data governance was a discussion paper that was published together with the Royal Society, and that can also be found on ALLEA's website, on flourishing in a data-enabled society, which addresses some of the issues that, from the point of view of the distribution and diffusion of medical information, is going to be more deeply delved into in today's webinar. So the tremendous developments in the health sector are now allowing for artificial intelligence-based diagnosis and for large-scale correlative medical studies. So this accelerates medical research and thus ultimately go to the benefit of patients. So it is key for this development that we reach a sustainable availability of personal health data from research, volunteers, and of course, patients. Now, so my colleague Christina referred to the specific challenge we have been recently exposed to, and we still are, with the COVID-19 pandemic, which precisely shows us that efficient sharing of such data is crucial to ensure speedy biomedical characterization, early diagnosis, and effective treatment. And finally, the COVID-19 pandemic has also demonstrated that health crises are not stopped by border and do not stop at disciplinary boundaries, but at both levels, boundaries are always fuzzy and require a global approach. Thus, I am very pleased that this important topic is being addressed in our joint report on international health data transfer. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion, to learning a lot, and by which I wish you all a wonderful and intellectually and scientifically inspiring afternoon. I would now like to immediately introduce our first speaker of today's seminar, who is Dr. Rosa Castro. Dr. Castro is a senior scientific policy officer at FEAM, and along with Dr. Robin Fierce from EASAC, she was one of the key forces of our two partner networks behind this tripartite collaboration on the international sharing of health data. She's a specialist in health law and policy, and has been a lecturer on intellectual property law and international health law. So two very key areas of today's seminar. Postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute in Florence and at Duke University in the US. Please, Rosa, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Antonio, and it's my pleasure. Let me just share a few slides with all of you, and just a second. And I'm very privileged to be here today. If only I could find the slides, it would be easier, but let me just try it again, because they are just here. But just to start, because we don't have much time and we have to listen from a wonderful panel too. Okay, here they are. That's good. And let me just start by saying very briefly that I'm very pleased to be here presenting. Just as you said, this is also joint work with the support of a wonderful working group, and of course of very specially of Dr. Robin Fierce. So his name is here because this is also joint work. Also, I take all the responsibility for any errors that you might see in these slides today. I want to go very briefly and to give you a bit of a context. Also, I will do this very quick because Antonio and Christina have already mentioned some of the key developments that we put into this slide, to just mention and highlight how the three networks of academy came together to cooperate on this issue, and how they did it very early during the first discussions or the first proposals that were put forward by the European Commission. So right after the first proposed text for the GDPR was out, FEAM had an early statement that was welcoming these proposals and asking for a few clarifications. Then very early, the three networks actually worked together with other key stakeholders, trying to identify some issues of concern for the research community. And again, highlighting this important need for a balance between addressing privacy concerns and protecting the personal data of patients and citizens, and enabling scientific research, which is also of benefit for citizens and patients. Right after the implementation of the GDPR, there was a wide discussion facilitated by the forum, FEAM Forum of biomedical stakeholders. And clearly one of the messages was that the scientific community had some concerns about the specific implementation and the diverse interpretation of the GDPR text across the EU. And hence, in 2019, I think it was very relevant and it was very natural that the three network of academies came together also to work based on ALLEA's work also on the flourishing in a data enabling society, which you mentioned, and on that work by FEAM and EASAC looking at health data. So they put their forces together and they started late 2019 this joint work. And at the same time, I have to mention that during 2020, of course, and during the whole COVID-19, the working group met virtually, and they produced finally this joint report that was peer reviewed and published in April 2019. At the same time, you can see there were a few developments on the other side. And one of them was the Schrems II judgment, which was handled by the European Court of Justice. And I'll leave it to Giske and especially to Heidi to look into more details, but it was a very important decision that was interpreting some important issues about international data transfers. And also, of course, the European Data Protection Board has developed some guidelines. And so it's a very important moment to bring this conversation. So of course, the main impetus behind this whole project is, as you already mentioned, it's first of all to highlight the value of public health research collaborations. And this is because, of course, collaborative health research benefits everyone. So it benefits society as a whole, healthcare systems, patients and citizens, and it is crucial then that data sharing takes place. This type of research can help to understand very complex disease pathways, but it can also help to understand determinants of health inequalities, improve the diagnosis and the treatment. So it's very important. In certain areas, it's crucial, or actually you cannot do research without this type of broad collaborations at international level. And one of the examples is, for instance, rare diseases, in which the researchers really need the data from every patient that they can gather. And for EU citizens, this is also very important to have the type of research that will compare and will try to assess whether the outcomes and determinants of disease are also relevant for them in light of the precise conditions, even the genomic or the environmental conditions. And finally, last but not least, research collaborations and data sharing make the most of limited resources and contributions that are made by patients and volunteers of this research. So very briefly, what are the type of research collaborations that have been at risk or affected? There are many more examples in the report, but I want to just mention a few. And one of them regards an international organization, so the WHO International Agency for Research on Cancer. Many others also regard large consortia that are collaborating. One of them is the US National Cancer Institute Cohort Consortium. Another one is on Alzheimer's, on International Genomics of Alzheimer's Consortium. And there are a few others. As you mentioned, of course, COVID-19 research, it's a very important example of how international collaboration enabled finding very good solutions very early. And importantly, only the initial COVID-19 data transfers were covered by a specific derogation, so it could also be affected in the long run. And as George mentioned, antimicrobial resistance and other very important public health challenges are also the type of research that could be affected here. So therefore, the objective of the joint project was, again, to illustrate the value of health research, to compare solutions and to try to identify possible solutions for safe data transfers outside of the European Economic Area, to inform the EU institutions about the needs and the problems that researchers were facing with these transfers, and to try to find examples also of how data sharing adds value to EU research. So basically to clarify the principles and the options that are available for reform or for finding solutions, taking into account, as you all mentioned, the many legal, ethical, and privacy ramifications of this issue. So there you have, I'm not going to repeat it, the report, which hopefully you have all looked at, or you can look in each of the websites of the three networks, was published in April 2021. It was informed also by discussions with key stakeholders, facilitated by the FEAM Forum, And it was the joint effort also of a wonderful working group. So it was really a privilege to work with these key experts coming from across Europe. So I'm just going to give you an overview, very brief, of the key messages of the joint report, and then I handle all the difficult issues from a scientific and legal point of view to Giske and Heidi. So I'm going to be very selfish here, but the key message number one is that health research is, of course, crucial, as you all said. So it helps in many ways. It helps health systems, it helps patients, and it helps to find new cures and diagnostic tools and treatments and vaccines. The value of this health research should also be better communicated. And this is something that the academies also look forward to do. The second message is that sharing pseudonymized personal health data with public, especially with public sector researchers outside of the EU and EEA, is actually very important because it makes use of very limited resources and it maximizes the value of those contributions by patients and volunteers. And here I just want to mention that most of the messages of the report are centering into and focusing on pseudonymized data. And the reasons are very diverse, and I leave, again, the difficult questions to the legal expert, Heidi. But it turns out that the threshold to consider the data as anonymous is very high in the GDPR. So it's very difficult to consider that a data will be completely anonymized and will be outside of the GDPR rules. Second reason is also like research that has been developed in the last few years, which has on re-identification, on the potential of re-identifying people that participate in this type of study. So it shows that actually it's very difficult to completely anonymize that data. This could be, for example, and I think this is the simple one, in rare diseases where you have such a small group of people, and hence, even if you anonymize all the data can be traced back to the people that participated in this type of research. So the key message number 3 is that addressing the potential privacy concerns of data sharing and international collaboration is, of course, very important. And we need to take into account patient views. But this is also part of a broader issue of building trust in research and researchers, which is, again, a very core area of the work that the academies and the networks participating here do. Key message number 4 is that the implementation of the GDPR is currently affecting data transfers outside of the EEA. And the data transfers are both the direct transfer of data, but also the remote access to data when this data is still at the original location. The GDPR is also affecting, the way that the GDPR is implemented and interpreted is also affecting secondary uses of data by institutions. And especially the focus of this work and report was the public sector again, because public sector researchers are facing particular hurdles. The next message is that the working group found that the best solutions to address these are under Article 46 of the GDPR, which offers a few possibilities. So, and this happens, and I think Heidi will go into more detail, but this is in the absence of a decision on adequacy. So a decision that says that a particular country has a legislation on data protection that is equivalent to the EU level of protection under the GDPR. So this is currently happening only for a few countries. And this does not include, for instance, the US, which is a major partner for many researchers. So in the absence of this type of adequacy decision, Article 46 of the GDPR offers some of the best solutions here, but more guidance and particular examples that are useful for the research community are very much needed here. So the idea in general is that researchers will focus on their research and not on trying to address this type of very complex hurdles. Now, finally, the two last messages are that we look, along with the working group, into some new technologies that are called privacy enhancing technologies. And these are very important to improve data security. However, currently at the level of development of these privacy enhancing technologies, these cannot circumvent the need for the transfers to abide by the GDPR requirements. So we need to monitor these in the future. And of course, all other technologies like artificial intelligence and big data are providing multiple opportunities, but this doesn't solve the issue that we're discussing today. Final message of the report is that the working group also brought so many disciplines and many aspects, for instance, as addressing the interoperability of data are very important. And so many other methodological and technical quality issues need to be addressed to facilitate the efficient and safe, secure data sharing for research. So I want to just finish with some of the quotes from the report, which mention some key recommendations. The first one is that the EU is placed in a key position, actually, to become a leader worldwide and to encourage countries to adopt appropriate privacy rules. So the working group welcomed the commitment by the European Commission to look at these issues and to develop guidance. However, the fact that there are so many research projects and types of research being affected or at risk means that the urgency was emphasized. I mean, we need to give this clear message that this is urgent now. And the immediate challenge now is to find a solution that balances the safe and respectful and respect of fundamental rights and does not conflict also with the laws of other countries or international organizations. And so this is a key moment as the European Union is also looking into how to enhance a health data space and is discussing its data strategy. So we hope that the international dimension of health research is not ignored. So I'll finish here. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rosa, for this very clear explanation of the importance of international health data sharing and for the summary of the report you co-wrote. We now continue with our next speaker, who is Dr. Heidi Beate Bentzen. She's a researcher in law at the Norwegian Research Center for Computers and Law at the University of Oslo and an academic affiliate of the University of Oxford. She specializes in data protection law in the field of health and particularly related to health research. And she's a member of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Privacy's Health Data Task Force, and she contributed to the drafting of the Global Recommendation on the Protection and Use of Health-Related Data. Heidi was part of our tripartite FEAM EASAC-ALLEA working group for the report on international sharing of personal data for research. And dear Heidi, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, I will present the legal challenges. The EU aims to strengthen its scientific and technological basis, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU guarantees the protection of personal data. The GDPR aims to balance these two objectives of protection and free movement of personal data. Scientific research enjoys a privileged position in the GDPR, and because it's a regulation, it creates increased legal harmonization across the European Economic Area, the EEA, and quite good conditions for data sharing within the EEA. However, health research is global and it's necessary to share data also with researchers outside the EEA. Both actual personal data transfers and provision of remote personal data access from non-EEA researchers to servers in the EEA are considered transfers of personal data to outside the EEA. Both situations require a legal data transfer mechanism according to Chapter 5 GDPR to be in place. And this applies to existing transfers conducted prior to the GDPR and to transfers one conducts now. Chapter 5 GDPR is three-tiered. One first needs to consider if the European Commission has decided that the third country or international organization offers an adequate level of protection. if an adequacy decision is not in place, one must provide appropriate safeguards. For specific situations, there are derogations in place. I will go through each of these three categories. Personal data can be transferred if the Commission has decided that the third country or international organization offers an adequate level of protection. Such transfers do not require any specific authorization, making it possible to transfer data in the same manner as within the EEA. This is what the world looks like with privacy glasses on. The navy-colored countries constitute the EEA, and the other blue countries have an adequacy decision from the Commission in place. This includes important research partner countries such as Japan and Switzerland, making data transfers to these countries unproblematic. I should mention that the situation as pertains to UK adequacy is currently unclear. Previously, private companies in the US could self-certify to the US Department of Commerce to offer adequate protection in relation to the Commission, the so-called Privacy Shield. This was invalidated last summer in the Court of Justice of the European Union Schrems II judgment. This was because US surveillance legislation given priority over Privacy Shield was found to be in violation of the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights. This affects US cloud providers, including their servers in the EEA. The European Parliament has urged the Commission not to adopt any new adequacy decision in relation to the US unless meaningful legal reform is first introduced in the US. Let's then turn to collaborations where there is not an adequacy decision in place and one instead must provide appropriate safeguards. I will use one of the world's largest research funders, the federal US institution, National Institutes of Health, NIH, as an example. However, the challenges extend to other third country research institutions and to international organizations such as those in the United Nations system. The GDPR provides a choice of 8 appropriate safeguards. All involve the non-EEA receiving institution to ensure adequate protection. Several of these transfer mechanisms can be excellent options for medical research. So it is not the text of the GDPR that creates problems for data transfers. So what is the problem? One is that 4 out of the 8 appropriate safeguards are not yet operable because we are still waiting for guidance from the EDPB. The EDPB has said that this guidance will come this year or next year. The other problem is statutory conflict between EU rules and other countries' laws. Where there does exist text from the Commission or guidance from the EDPB, this introduces statutory conflicts. This is the case for 3 of the 8 safeguards. That only leaves us with binding corporate rules, and those are not applicable for our types of transfers. Let's take a closer look at some of the appropriate safeguards, starting with the most common one, the Commission's standard contractual clauses. This can be possible to use when transferring data to a private company or university. However, US federal institutions cannot sign the SEC as it conflicts with at least 5 US federal laws. A new SEC version has just been approved and will be published tomorrow. Fingers crossed that it will have solved all issues, though that is unlikely. Other appropriate safeguards include bespoke contracts between public bodies or non-legally binding administrative arrangements between public bodies. For these, there are EDPB guidelines in place. The main obstacle to EU-US research data transfers and what is preventing us from using, for instance, administrative arrangements is the lack of enforceable rights and legal remedies in place for European research participants in the US due to US federal institutions being protected by sovereign immunity. This means that a European research participant does not have legal remedies against the NIH if there should be a large data breach. The US has a sovereign immunity waiver in place for US research participants, granting them enforceable rights and legal remedies, which ought to be extended to non-US participants whose data is processed by US federal institutions. That would make it possible to use one of these appropriate safeguards. A further appropriate safeguard option is an approved code of conduct. Currently, the EDPB has only issued guidance for codes of conduct to be used within the EEA and not for international transfers. Making a code of conduct is a very time-consuming process. From the guidelines for such codes to be used within the EEA, it is clear that there is a requirement to establish an independent monitoring body and to finance that body. In the Schrems II judgment, the court states that one must ensure an essentially equivalent level of protection as in the Union. One must therefore assess the legal situation in the country one intends to transfer to, which is extremely demanding for individual research institutions. And depending on the conclusion, one must add supplementary measures to the appropriate safeguard to achieve an EU level of protection. The EDPB has issued guidance for supplementary measures, but these are unfortunately not well suited for medical research. The EDPB suggests pseudonymization, but defines it in a manner that diverges from the GDPR and from what is possible to achieve in medical research. Personal data is almost always pseudonymized in medical research, but in the manner that pseudonymization is defined in the GDPR. Therefore, in the public consultation round, the Nordic Society of Human Genetics and Precision Medicine suggested to the EDPB over 20 technical, organizational, and legal supplementary measures suitable for health research transfers. And it would be useful to know if the EDPB finds that recipe acceptable. Absent an adequacy decision and appropriate safeguards, it may still be possible to transfer data if one of the derogations for specific situations apply. What the derogations have in common is that one does not conclude an agreement with the receiving institution, instead placing the increased data protection risk that involves on the research participant. This is the reason why the derogations must be used with caution. The research participant can consent to a specific transfer after having been informed of the risks. One can transfer data if it's necessary for important reasons of public interest recognized in law. For instance, initial COVID data transfers during the pandemic. For long-term COVID projects, one must instead use appropriate safeguards. One can transfer data if it's necessary in order to protect the vital interests, meaning essential healthcare, to an individual. This cannot be used for general medical research where the advantages to people's health are in the future. Lastly, there's a safety valve that can be used if a number of very strict conditions are met. So where there is not an adequacy decision in place from the Commission, data transfers in medical research should, as a main rule, be conducted on the basis of Article 46 GDPR and supplementary measures. As the report from the European Academy Networks concluded, this means that we need help getting an operative Article 46 GDPR appropriate safeguard that can be used for medical research. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for your detailed description of the legal challenges imposed by the GDPR and for offering solutions on how these could be resolved. We now swiftly move to our final speaker, who is Professor Giske Ursin. Professor Ursin is the director of the Cancer Registry of Norway and professor at the Department of Basic Medical Sciences at the University of Oslo. Her research is on cancer epidemiology, and she has been involved in challenges and opportunities in the use of big data to improve cancer prevention and treatment. And Professor Ursin has previously chaired the Scientific Council of the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and has also chaired the National Cancer Institute Consortium Steering Group. She's a member of the Norwegian Academy of Sciences and was also part of our tripartite working group that prepared this report. So, Professor Ursin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your nice introduction. So now you're going to hear the solutions from a practitioner's point of view. So I run a research institution and I do cancer research myself. So how do we perceive these solutions that you heard a little bit about now? So what I will be talking about in practice is essentially two things in terms of possible solutions for safe sharing or pseudonymized data. I'll talk a little bit about privacy enhancing technologies, and then a little bit about legal solutions in practice. So when it comes to the privacy enhancing technologies, the question that we get the most often is, can these be used instead of sharing pseudonymized data? So I'm going to give you two examples to show you the strengths and the challenges with these. So the first one is synthetic data. So what is synthetic data? Well, it's essentially fake data. It's computer generated data. And this is one example of some colleagues that we work with, how they create these synthetic data based on actual real data. But perhaps the most well-known are these images, these pictures of people that do not exist. Now, the goal of synthetic data is that the data should look real, I mean, it should look like a person and not like a dog. And at the same time, we want these data to be anonymous. Now, the concern about this data is that for researchers, the concern is that the synthetic data, will they really truly reflect the complex patterns between exposures and disease? And another concern is that if these data become too perfect, if they're too similar to the real data, then we also have a concern. If this lady were to look like one of you, we would have a problem. Now, we use synthetic data today, and at my institution, we use it if we want to make large training sets, and if it's on a large enough group of people that we've used as a basis, but then we always end up actually testing the real associations in real data. So synthetic data has a place, but it's relatively limited use. Now, another example that we use is federated analysis. And the principle behind this is that we send the data algorithms or the programs to the data. We do not send the data. And the classical manual way of doing is that you have a researcher, and the researcher sends his data programs to colleagues in other countries, other centers, and these colleagues, they then do the analysis on their own data and send it back to the researcher, and the researcher simply gets aggregate anonymous results in return. Now, the concern about this is that it does actually add some noise statistically. And then there's also some concerns about privacy, because if these are very rare diseases, then the results that are going back to the researchers will not be anonymous. But then the most important concern is that this is really a cumbersome way of doing analysis, a very old-fashioned way of doing it. But this is what we still use now quite a bit. An alternative are some of the more automatic versions. And this is then when the researcher actually sends the programs to a data server, and the server then communicates with servers at different centers. And then the results go back and then end up going anonymously to the researcher. But the problem here is, as you see, these light blue arrows, they actually go in behind the firewall at these different centers. So there are some security issues here. So although this gives us less noise statistically, when we do it in an iterative fashion, it does have some privacy concerns, and it definitely has some IT security concerns. So this was very simplified, but essentially with these examples, I wanted to show you that we do use privacy enhancing technologies today, but they do have limitations. And regardless of which ones they are, they tend to have these limitations, this noise versus privacy that we have to evaluate. And none of these technologies actually replace the need to share data. And some of the examples Rosa stressed in her presentation. So what about the legal solutions for safe data transfer of pseudonymized data? Where are we? Now, Heidi has talked about this, and I'm going to just stress a few points. Now, this is one interesting challenge. What about the data that were legally transferred before GDPR went into effect, and where there is currently no adequacy decision or Article 46 transfer mechanism or safeguard available, as Heidi alluded to? This is one example. This is a slide that Dr. Robert East, who you will hear from later, showed a couple of years ago. And it shows the large number of ongoing projects between European institutions and national institutes of health in the US. There were a total of 5,000 ongoing projects at the time. Now, these are projects that are, many of them are still ongoing, and results are being published as we speak. Now, this is an interesting and sort of an absurd challenge we've ended up with. And I could have had another example here. I could have showed you the cancer data worldwide that is at the World Health Organization or at the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which makes these beautiful cancer maps. These cancer maps in Europe, you will still find that you can find our statistics there, and that's because IARC still has those data, but there is no transfer mechanism anymore. So this is an absurd problem, and it really needs to be solved. So how can one solve it? Well, Heidi talked about these derogations. Is this one instance where we really need to use that Article 49 derogation safe to evolve? And if not, does each country have to amend our laws in order to use another of the derogations, Article 49 1D public interest? Now that was old data, but what about new projects moving forward? Well, Heidi said we have some of these possible appropriate safeguards, and yes, we do for private institutions. For if you want to work with a pharmaceutical company or a private university, for example, in the United States, it's possible we can use the EU standard data protection clauses. But if we want to work in the public sector with federal institutions in the US or with international organizations such as WHO, then we have the problem. So how can we solve this? So we need these usable transfer mechanisms. And again, here I use the federal US institutions as an example. Well, and this gets a little technical. This is for the lawyers. We need creative solutions to solve this redress indemnification challenge and to ensure that we have that the rights of European citizens are protected. But I have to tell you that the risk of something being violated, the risk of a legal challenge also from participants is extremely low if the data transfer is combined with strong technical measures such as remote access or other technical measures that reduce the backwards identifiability of these data. So this really should just be solved. And another instance where it's so important to find a mechanism is for those special situations where the data transfer has to be possible. For example, we have blood samples, and I have examples of this from my own institutions. We wanted to share it with the National Cancer Institute to look for specific markers for lung cancer. And the laboratory analysis had to be done at the laboratory in the federal institutions in the US for research purposes, but we couldn't do it because of this problem. And there are also these instances where researchers look at extremely rare cancers, for example. They actually need to get the data in order to analyze it sensibly. And so we're hoping that we can get transfers based on a bespoke safeguard, but this is really difficult. We're not there because we need to have this redress indemnification challenge solved. Now, I also have a wish for the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board. We really need guidelines for all the Article 46 mechanisms, as Heidi said. But one more thing, for these post-FEAM supplementary measures, we received these recommendations in November last year, and it's actually a very well-written document. It's very easy to understand, but in practice, it's not useful because the assessments that are required from the European institutions are so demanding that it's not possible. So we really need examples of questions and adequate responses from the parties in the international organizations or from the parties in the United States. And we also need examples of adequate assessments. What do we as research institutions have to do? When will it be adequate? Please just give us some good examples. So in conclusion, as far as the solutions are concerned, well, we use technical solutions today, but they simply do not replace the need to share data. And for legal solutions, we need transfer mechanisms that are also usable for public sector research. And to the EDPB, we need guidelines on all Article 46 mechanisms. And we need examples of questions and adequate responses and assessments that we are required to do for supplementary measures. And so finally, just want to reiterate what the previous speakers have said. Safe data sharing internationally is essential for medical research. And I would love to just challenge the panel, because it's so easy to say that the answer to this challenging question is on the other side of the table. So my challenge to you is, what can you do to solve this problem? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giske, for this very vivid description of the potential technological and legal solutions to allow for safe and effective sharing of personal health data and the problems, of course, that we encounter therein. Very well, so we now move to the next stage of the program, and I'm very pleased to pass the word on back to my colleague, George Griffin, President of FEAM and co-chair of the working group. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Antonio. Well, what a complex situation that this committee faced. We all knew we wanted to do it, but we could see challenges there. And we have just been given the task, what can you do to help? It seemed to me at the end of this, and I am not a lawyer, I do not have a law qualification, but I have a medical and a biomedical higher qualification, work as a physician, and have done research in many countries, both developing and developed. Ethiopia, Colombia, just to name two of them, work on infection, which is my field, and vaccination. Two questions that I don't think we have covered properly, and that is the first one of ethical approval. And I hope we can discuss this a little. Ethical approval for me doing these research projects overseas involved approval from my own institution, one of the major medical schools in the University of London, St. George's, and ethical approval from the local situation where I was doing work. And that was absolutely crucial. At one time, you didn't need this. And this is still in power. The other thing, which was briefly mentioned, was the transfer of data is awkward enough as it stands, but the transfer of tissues is even more difficult. And many countries say you cannot even send blood from our country across to yours, even if the assays which are going to be carried out are not available in the host country. So there are many issues. The unifying thing is we all see the importance of sharing data. And Antonio knows me well, and he knows my regular saying, when things get tough, go back to first principles. And the first principle is we all want data to be anonymized, and we all want data to be exchangeable to the benefit of mankind. And that's how I look at this. Very simple. Well, it's very simple, but the solution, as we've heard, is not going to be quite as easy as that. So what we are going to do now is have a panel discussion from with 5 absolutely eminent people in this area, people who've either done research overseas or who have organized research at a very high level. Again, a legal aspect, again, thinking now about the patients who are involved and the volunteers who are involved, because this doesn't just involve the investigator and the countries, it involves people, and we must never, ever forget that. So each of the panelists is going to speak for 3 to 5 minutes to tell us what their views are, and then we will have discussion. And the panelists will start off discussion between themselves, and then, of course, anyone who is a guest will have raised their hand, and Rosa will be looking at these questions and send them through. So with that in mind, it's a great pleasure to introduce Robert East. Robert is a major leader based at the Fogarty International Center at NIH, and I must say I've had many interactions with the Fogarty Center and visited it many times. It leads the US initiatives in international health and research. Robert has had many major responsibilities with the White House, for example, national drug control policy, a thing which is dominating many areas of health and social life at the moment. And he has degrees from the University of Maryland and Oxford University. His current post is at NIH, and it's a great pleasure, Robert, to ask you to give us your thoughts.
Thank you very much, George. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to share some broad perspectives from the NIH, both on the report and more broadly on the GDPR. First, let me commend the report. I think it's been instrumental in pivoting attention to the public sector issues related to GDPR. I sit on a number of international coordinating committees that are composed of US government officials. In the last few years, the preoccupation has been on the privacy shield and on commercial transfers. So it's gratifying and well received. It was particularly gratifying that this report received such heavy media coverage as well as social media shares in its first weeks after publication. I would also note that without overstating this, I do think that European policymakers very often are once removed from the decisions that are made on a daily basis in European research institutions and universities. So the notion of having a report that actually comes from the trenches, that's generated by academic experts and practitioners has been so important. I would say, I think it's important for NIH to recognize that the GDPR is the most relevant and impactful data privacy legislation in over 20 years. It is arguably the global baseline. It's an interesting and apt coincidence that it was passed at the time that the Cambridge Analytica scandals were being reported by media outlets. The United States government embedded a privacy law on 20 years of human subjects protection in 2001 in the Health Insurance and Portability and Accountability Act. And institutional review boards still have lingering issues with HIPAA 20 years after its ratification. But HIPAA, unlike GDPR, was a sector-specific regulation. GDPR, of course, is an omnibus regulation, and biomedical research is governed under the same principles as commercial marketing and finance. So in many instances, the NIH, which is indirectly regulated by the GDPR, does feel that we're caught in the metaphorical crossfire in looking for ways that open science and privacy safeguards can be reconciled through remedies or through more clarified interpretations within the GDPR. We have been unable to, we've concluded only one data sharing agreement with a European institution since enactment of the GDPR in May of 2018. And that is because that was outlined by the excellent presentations by Giske and Heidi, the fact that because of statutory conflict and principles of sovereign immunity, an organization like the NIH cannot sign on to the Article 46 safeguards and the Article 49 derogations based on their strict interpretation by the European Data Protection Board are very limited options for the NIH. I do think that I agree that an Article 46 safeguard would be the most durable solution and mechanism, with the one caveat: could the United States government possibly be able to negotiate an adequacy decision that was sector specific, covering, for example, HIPAA and common rule sites in the United States? This administration seems open to renewed dialogue and a transatlantic agenda with Europe. And I would say that our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, brought these issues up, specifically GDPR implications and effects on health research, with Ursula von der Leyen when he visited Brussels in the spring. And these issues are on the agenda for the president's visit in mid-month to Brussels. So I think there's a good deal presently, a political momentum for some type of solution for the GDPR, which is very gratifying. I also would agree that it may well take concessions on the part of the United States, particularly extended waivers in our Privacy Act that would enable European participants in biomedical research collaborations to have judicial redress in the United States. I'm assuming that will be a threshold requirement. It will require a congressional act, but I do think that is part of the pathway forward. And let me conclude by noting that there's a legacy of discovery with Europe. The NIH, through collaborations with European partners, has been able to generate improved pertussis vaccines, as well as produce the first clotbuster drug, the first thrombolytic agent, through collaborations with Belgium and France. And there are many other discoveries that I could cite. Both Europe and the United States have a shared urgent interest in advancing personalized or precision medicine. And that, as alluded to earlier, is going to require the active participant, the active recruitment of patient populations, both in Europe and the United States, in order to do trials with sufficient strength to study subtypes of common diseases as well as uncommon diseases. GDPR is regrettably sort of impeding that important prospect of actually beginning to classify and treat diseases based on molecular knowledge, based on their molecular signature. So I would note that this issue of creative ways to reconcile the common values of data privacy safeguard and open science this is a really a formative moment. And the fact that the GDPR is a global baseline means that remedies of the present circumstance will have broader repercussions globally. And with that, thank you so much for the opportunity to share these remarks, and look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was realistic, a lot of common sense, and a sign that says we have work to do without the slightest doubt. But GDPR exists, healthcare and health research exist. And I like your comment at the beginning. What's it like in the trenches? The people who are actually doing the research, and the patients and the volunteers. And that's what concerns me as well, of course, as an operative in these things. and Antonio will tell you, he gets bored with me saying this. I never use the word manage, I use the word enable. And how can we enable these things to work smoothly and with ease and as the way forward? Robert, thank you very much. Now we move on now to the second speaker. This is Giske Suzulu, and Giske works in, for the Patient Forum, the European Patients Forum, and really is passionate about this idea of that data saves life, which is an initiative from there. It's a great pleasure to introduce Giske and ask her to tell us about the patient's view and her organization's view. Giske.
Thank you, George. First of all, I would like to congratulate the team about the report. Actually, it was an enlightenment from my side, because you have to understand, when you look at it from the patient side, it's the kitchen. So what you are doing is the kitchen side of the whole setup, and it's quite complex, and it's very clear that there's so much that's happening behind the scenes until the solutions or evidences are built for patients. So as EPF, many of you know, we work with the chronic disease patients. The initiative we have, Data Saves Lives, is actually very highly focusing on the trustworthy data sharing. And we know it supports the health and scientific research and to meet the needs of the patients, public, and address the challenges faced by our health systems, not only Europe, but globally. What we also know is it needs to be well established and meaningful. So it has to be, the informed consent mechanisms have to be in place so that patients actually understand, not fully, but at least understand what's going on behind the scenes, why things take so much more time, and why it's still very important that everybody cares about their safety and protecting their data, that these people are actually trustworthy. But at the same time, there are risks. So they have to be also informed about the risks. So in the report, it was very clear, while protecting the patients and the data, you need to promote the research. So how to put the balance. It's very important, we think, as EPF, patients should be in control of their data, and they should be responsible for their data and understand the work, and then their consent is very important when they know what's going on. Because at this point with COVID-19, we know the populations became more health data literate, health literate more than health data literate probably, but we're not there yet. Even within Europe, there is a long way to go. It's very fundamental once patients understand the importance of the health data sharing, and their consent is fundamental, and them being part of research, and they can trust certain groups, and who are those groups and what are the methods behind and the technology, like you mentioned, because we know that's going to be one of the fundamental areas. The technology will be supporting tremendously the research to protect health data, so that we can move forward with the technologies coming up. We know we're not there yet, but it's important for patients to be also involved in the co-creation of those systems. So it's a big system altogether we have to work on, and for us to understand the patient's standpoint, where they can interfere and where they can be involved. Again, we're going back to empowerment, and even already reading the report for me and hearing the discussions today, the GDPR, the value of GDPR is being discussed very highly. We know the challenges with GDPR as well, but we're still a small group as the patient organization representatives. We know within the membership already there are a lot of unknowns, and their understanding levels are still in question. So we think we need to promote the health data, importance of health data sharing, but the importance of understanding the health data and the GDPR, and also cross-border importance of health data sharing, because Europe is too small. We saw it with COVID. It's too small. It needs to get outside those borders, because there is a whole world out there, and there's a lot of data being collected, and it's co-creation again, will be very important. So as patient organizations representative, I could clearly say that the report is, I think, very nicely highlighting the points, that the actually first steps at least. And I can also support the fact that patients, when now they're getting more involved, they will be behind all the developments that will take place, so that we can support as much as we can for the responsible health data sharing, and it's important. So we will continue promoting and promoting the idea of informing people about the importance of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Godse. It's really good to know that patients are being represented in such a positive way. And of course, at the end of the day, it's about patients and volunteers, and it's for the benefit of man and womankind, the use of these data. It's very good to know you have such a realistic view on this from your organization. And thank you very much for a very clear talk. Now, we move on then to the third talk now from Brendan Barnes. And Brendan is the Director of Data Protection and IP at the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. And of course, that group is very aware of the need for volunteers and patients for clinical trials. And so what we've been discussing today is of great relevance to them. So Brendan, delighted to have you to give a talk.
Okay, thank you, George, and thanks to the organisers for inviting us. I'm in a sort of tricky situation because you've produced a really good report. I mean, I think it describes the situation very well, and it's a good, to me, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems a good analysis of the solutions and their limitations. The report focuses on the problems that have been encountered, I think, in terms of data transfers between public organisations and particularly sort of, and also potentially publicly funded organisations. So I suppose the first thing I want to do, certainly we are very concerned at FBIA by those problems. I mean, we represent the private sector, but there's so much important sort of basic research and research in collaboration that goes on in public institutions that this has to be of concern to us. It also has, to some extent, impacted us more directly in that we are obviously required to share clinical trial data internationally with medicines regulatory agencies and pharmacovigilance data. And in both of those cases, we've sort of encountered that there is a little bit of grit in the system that wasn't there before, and people are saying, if we sign off on this informed consent, are we okay to do that if you're going to transfer the data to the US? And we're talking here about transferring the data to the FDA for the purposes of medicines approval. So there's that sort of, even for our transfers as well, there's that sort of grit in the wheels at the moment, which is, I think, to a degree, it's about legal uncertainty. People don't know what the rules are. The GDPR is a good framework, but it's a horizontal framework, and I think it was always anticipated that it would need to be infilled in particular sectors. So this is, creating a really difficult situation for us because these sort of transfers are legal obligations. So again, it's part of this dynamic that we've got at the moment, that you have a legal obligation, and the question of how do you do that in compliance with GDPR is not wholly nailed down. And it's the tension between pieces of European legislation, let alone what we might be required of us in other jurisdictions. So I think in terms of the sort of looking to solutions, and I think the last previous speakers have talked about risk mitigation measures, the privacy enhancing technologies and so on. These are useful, but again, in the spirit of saying we agree with much of the report, you know, the need for something on the in the legal space is quite clear. I suppose we found it, I think what we've seen happen in the last 6 months is that essentially the burden of proof on demonstrating adequacy has been shifted from the authorities to the data exporter, which is a really, I think, a challenging situation for everyone. And I think in principle, at least, you know, that that requirement to demonstrate adequacy is case specific. So, you know, it's something you potentially need to do for each country, for each type of transfer. So it's not a one-off exercise, and it's a very heavy burden, and I imagine particularly challenging for the public sector. So what are the sort of ways forward? Again, you pick up on many of them in the report. I mean, I think looking at the public interest mechanism makes sense. Previous speaker, the first speaker on the panel, referred to sectoral adequacy decisions. I think there's maybe one of the EU's current adequacy decisions which is sectoral, and I imagine the Commission would be concerned at the workload of producing sectoral adequacy decisions. But in this area, at least, I think there is a really good grounding of best practice about how you share data, which could be something that could be built on. And then there are the standard contractual clauses, and, you know, potentially an option of developing sectoral alternatives there, which what I saw in the report was that's not quite so interesting for your members. It is something that our members have looked at and are still interested in. First speaker on the panel said this is a formative moment. I think we completely agree. You know, this data sharing needs to take place, and you made the very compelling case that there are areas of research where you just need that volume of data. The other thing that I would say, really by way of closing, is that what we're talking about here from a European perspective is supposed to be a small component in the idea of making Europe fit for the digital age, which is, you know, the banner headline. If you look on the Commission website, it's one of the 6 policy goals of this Commission. So I suspect the Commission already know this, but it's probably worth emphasizing that making us fit doesn't mean turning us into a fortress. It means making sure that those transfers of data and knowledge can continue, because for us to become a competitive force, and I talk about competitiveness here as I'm from the private sector, for us to become a competitive force means you have to learn from other people. And to do that, you have to be able to collaborate. So I'll leave it there. I hope it didn't take too long.
Right, thank you very much, Brendan. Common sense and your feelings are really very helpful. Clearly, this is a start, and we've got to take it further. Now we move on now, and time is getting on. So we were due to finish, in fact, in just 5 minutes. But I've been told that there is more time on the Zoom for us, and I'm anxious not to stymie anyone with time constraints. So we move on now to our 4th speaker. This is ALLEA-EASAC-FEAM from the European Commission of Justice. She's a member of the international body that looks at data flows and protection in the EU, and she is responsible as part of the team for the beginnings of this EU-US data flow that we heard about at the beginning from Robert. It's a great pleasure to introduce Elisa, and Elisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to briefly react to the report and also react to some of the things that have been said and some of the questions that I've seen also in the Q&A to try to address as much as I can in one go, also mindful of the time. When it comes to the report, I think it very clearly underlines the importance of international data transfers for scientific research purposes. And of course, this is something that is not called into question by the GDPR. As the report itself also says, the rules in this area have actually not changed with the GDPR. They were in place for more than 20 years. And the GDPR further clarified the rules and also introduced new possibilities to transfer data. So I want to react a bit to some of the things that I've heard about, what has been said about the different instruments that are available under the GDPR, and perhaps also set the record straight on some of those. Maybe just to say a few things on adequacy, because I've heard some things about sectoral decisions. Indeed, this is a possibility under the GDPR, and in the Commission, we're always open to explore any new adequacy decisions together with third countries that are interested in this. At the moment, there are two that are more sectoral, that only cover the private sector, but I do want to highlight that all the other existing adequacy decisions cover also the public sector, for example, because a lot has been said about the public sector today, and also the new ones that we're currently working on. So, for example, the draft that was published for the UK and the adequacy talks that we recently concluded with South Korea, they would also both cover transfers to the public sector. So just to inform you about that. Then about the standard contractual clauses, which have also been mentioned a few times. I noted that the report says that they work well. They're regularly being used in the context of research cooperation between private operators. As was already said, we will adopt new standard contractual clauses, indeed, probably tomorrow. And they will provide, a further modernized tool that it covers additional transfer scenarios, has also been made more user-friendly and more flexible. In revising the standard contractual clauses, we engaged extensively with stakeholders, also with members of the research community. And just to let you know, I remember very well the comments that we received from the research community, including on aspects, for example, such as sharing data with regulators in third countries. So cannot tell you how the final SECs will look like. You'll have to see for yourself tomorrow, but I can assure you that we carefully looked at these comments and thought about how we could possibly address them. These new standard contractual clauses will also provide a toolbox to help those that use the standard contractual clauses to comply with the requirements that follow from the Schrems II judgment, which was also mentioned today. And here, just a side note, because of course, the requirements of this judgment apply to any transfer to any data exporter in the EU. But I do want to make maybe a side note for your specific area of scientific research. I think that the type of data that is transferred abroad in the context of health research is probably normally not of particular interest to national security agencies, which is what the Schrems II judgment, for example, was all about. So I think that in that sense, researchers might actually be in a better position than certain other commercial sectors. But of course, the requirements still apply, that's true. Let me also say a few words on the standard contractual clauses and the public sector, because it's true that they are not designed for transfers to public bodies or to international organizations. And one of the reasons is simply that it's very difficult to develop one standardized instrument that could be used to transfer data to all types of public authorities around the world and international organizations that may have very different status, maybe very much subject to different national requirements. And this is especially the case for aspects that have been raised today, also redress and oversight, where for commercial operators, the standard contractual clauses require the data importer in a third country to submit themselves to the jurisdiction of EU data protection authorities and EU courts. And of course, obviously, for the public sector, this is not possible. But this is a way to standardize. It makes it possible to have one instrument that can be used for transfers to different third countries. So it's very difficult to design the same type of instrument that would work across the board for the public sector. That said, there are other instruments, and one of them indeed are the administrative arrangements that were also mentioned already a few times. And here, I also want to highlight that the EDPB issued detailed guidance on this, and actually the final version of this guidance takes into account several comments that were received from the research community. So I think there have been additional clarifications on archiving rules, exceptions to individual rights, for example. And I also want to clarify maybe this aspect of the enforceable remedies, enforceable rights, because I've heard now a few times that this is not possible to organize this, for example, in the US, because there's no possibility to have judicial remedies for EU individuals. But on this aspect, I think it has to be clear that the guidelines of the EDPB very clearly say that while judicial redress, access to courts is of course sort of the gold standard, this is not an absolute requirement. And I think the guidelines very clearly show that there is a flexibility, that different safeguards, in particular oversight and redress, can be organized, can be designed in different ways to take into account the status of the data importer on the receiving end. And I think it's also important to note that actually administrative arrangements are already being used in different contexts and for transfers to different third countries. And by the way, this also includes the United States, to which reference has been made several times, because since the GDPR entered into application, several administrative arrangements have been concluded in different EU member states and with different public bodies in the US, for example, in the context of financial supervision. So I think this shows that it must be possible to design certain safeguards that are aligned with the guidelines, but at the same time take into account the specificities of a specific project or the status of the data importer. Wanted to say, sorry.
Have you any concluding comments? We're going to have to move on, I'm afraid.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to still say that indeed the codes of conduct, I saw that the report recognizes this as an important opportunity. I fully agree with that. Maybe then as a concluding remark, I just wanted to say a sentence that really struck me in the report that said that it's not a matter of adding extra mechanisms, but rather to ensure that the current ones work well. And I agree with that. There's nothing in the GDPR or in the guidance of the EDPB that prohibits data transfers. A toolbox is available, but it's true that these instruments need to be developed. And unless they are more standardized, like the standard contractual clauses, this has to be done by those that want to transfer the data. But I think that guidance is available and examples exist. So I think there is enough material to start from. Now I'll stop here. Sorry for being too long.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. You have a complex job. Thank you. And we move on now to the last speaker, Professor Christina Moberg, who is Professor of Ethics and Theory of Medicine. And this Christina is going to be the last speaker, because with this title, University of Cologne, of course, with this title, I'm sure her professional life on ethics and the theory of medicine will begin to wrap up the things that we've been talking about. So Christiana, it's a great pleasure to introduce you and have you on the panel.
Thank you very much, George, and dear all, thank you for this exciting invitation. I'm glad to participate. First, I want to congratulate the consortia for this really interesting, exciting report. I especially appreciated the examples. And I want to present 3 points for further discussion, if we have a little bit of time, starting from the point that not only using data can imply ethical problems, but that not using data can be an ethical problem in itself. So there is not the one solution, obviously, for the manifold ethical considerations regarding autonomy, personal integrity, privacy, non-discrimination, etc., because from the ethical point, it's of course more than privacy. So my first thought is that we could think about an additional instrument to those already discussed, and I mean a new innovative form of consent in terms of a meta-consent. This means that an individual determines in a general overarching way which data may be used, by whom and where and for what purpose. For example, the individual can distinguish whether data may be used by commercial or public researchers, whether it can be used only in Europe or also in Africa, but not in the US, for research on oncological diseases, but not on mental disorders. The individual can also decide whether data may be used only from the electronic health record or also from wearables, etc. And the individual can define for which kind of research an explicit consent should be requested instead. For example, if data shall be given to Chinese big tech companies or so. This consent is given once and it can be changed in the future according to the preferences of the person concerned. And it can also be applied to data that were collected in the past. The ethical advantage of such an approach is that the individual can decide autonomously and express his or her preferences, while at the same time it is not necessary to give an explicit consent for every single study. If such a meta-consent is introduced on a legal basis, I assume that it can be consistent with the GDPR. It will take time to develop such a meta-consent. It's not an immediate solution, obviously. It can be developed ideally together with citizens and the EPF, for example, but it will foster autonomy and trust. And now I come to the second point, that another additional aspect is the introduction of further legal prohibitions of exploiting of such data. So data minimization has no longer to be a main principle for protecting privacy if an inadequate and discriminatory use of data to the detriment of the individual is prohibited and punished. An example, though not applicable to research, is the gene diagnostics law in Germany, which regulates that, for example, insurers or employers may not ask persons for data and are not allowed to use them, even if the person provides them deliberately and voluntarily. This could also be important with regard to profiling for different purposes. So if other researchers come in. Third, we should discuss and define what health-related data means. I was excited and grateful that the authors of the report stressed the impact of research on reducing health inequalities. But having in mind the manifold socioeconomic determinants of health, more and other kinds of data than the so-called classical health-related data are needed for that purpose. For example, income, conditions of living, education, etc. So actually, if we take the definition of health of the WHO seriously, almost all data of our lives are health-related data. But that is obviously not meant by the GDPR when regulating special categories of personal data according to Article 9. However, this problem has also to be taken into account when health inequalities in the international arena are so dependent on socioeconomic aspects, as we see it so burdening in the pandemic as well. So that would be my 3 points very quickly. And I have 2 questions to the speakers actually. So I would be very interested what Giske thinks about swarm learning, because I think this is the next step to federated learning. You don't need a central researcher or a central model, but you have everything via blockchain distributed to the data silos. So the algorithm really comes to the data. And I would be interested what you all think about data trust schemes. In the Data Ethics Commission, which I co-chaired and that gave the opinion in 2019 to the German government, we stressed the importance of data trust schemes that could play a role in or have starting points in different aspects that has been addressed starting from the GDPR today in the discussion. So that would be interesting for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Christina. Those 3 points all put the emphasis back on the cooperation, of course, of the patient and the understanding of the patient and how the patient can be properly involved, which of course those of us involved in this sort of research all adhere to. Now, time has run out, but Christiana has posed 2 very interesting questions, and her 3 points are fascinating. I wonder if, just as the last thing before Volker sums up at the end, if any of the panelists have any particular comments they would like to make about Christiana's points.
I can perhaps start. I think these are very interesting new technologies that are coming, Christiana, and we are involved in some of the work as well. But I think that currently we consider them as sort of supplemental measures, and then they need to be really tested out in research projects to see how good they are and that we really feel that they're safe enough.
I think a comment from me, George.
Yeah.
I think I'm not quite sure I totally understand the idea of data trusts, but I think that we do see value in sort of trying to clarify the role of data intermediaries, if you like. So people who would curate data and would potentially act as an interface with data subjects in terms of explaining how their rights could be exercised. And that's something I think the Commission is trying to advance through the Data Governance Act. We don't sort of agree with everything the Commission have said in the Act, but I think that's something that they're trying to do, is to create that sort of stratum of entities which curate data and potentially manage rights on behalf of subjects.
Thank you, Brendan. Any other comments? Well, you know, we could have gone on for a lot longer, and rather than solve problems, we have investigated problems. And what I personally hope is that this new report from the 3 academies could provide a basis for going forward. And the other thing I would say, as someone who's been involved in clinical research for many, many years in developed and developing countries, we have to keep it as simple as we can for the patient, for the investigator, and for industry as well. Because to develop new drugs now is being regarded, of course, as a partnership. And this is so very, very important. So I think my final comment would be, keep it simple. And thank you all very much, the panelists, for just giving absolutely superb and very informative talks. Now, it's a great pleasure to hand over to a very, very good friend of mine, Volker Termulen, who has been listening all the way through to give some final comments before we finish. Volker.
Okay, thank you very much, George. I think, as you just heard, I have been asked to close our meeting with some closing remarks. And in view of the time which are running out, let me just say that I think we all probably agree that this was a very informative meeting in which we discussed very important issues raised for making most of the data for research while protecting personal privacy. As we have heard, solutions can be found and indeed must be implemented urgently if the citizens of the EU will in the future have a chance to continue benefiting from international research. And I really hope that the EU Commission and the proper committees will take up what we have suggested and will find solutions to change the situation so that in the future research data can be changed and can be exchanged between different groups outside from Europe, outside Europe, and vice versa. And that this will probably change and help all of us in the medical field and those who are doing research in the medical area. In addition, I would like to thank our presenters and panelists. I would like to take the opportunity to thank my colleagues from EASAC, ALLEA, and FEAM for their great work in organizing this webinar. It was running perfectly well, I must say. And I would also thank the 3 presidents for their leadership and in pursuing this, the first ever tripartite project of our academies. I hope we will continue in the future by adequate topics that we come together and work together and find solutions together. Last but not least, I thank you all in the audience for joining us today. Have hopefully had an interesting session. We welcome certainly your further feedback by email or any other issues we have discussed today. And we welcome your ideas and your involvement on how to take forward the priorities of the action. And certainly I wish all of us a nice day. And as a virologist and medic, I hope that all of you will have a chance soon to get immunized against coronavirus or have already been immunized coronavirus, so that the next time we can have such a meeting in person, which would be much more fun than just sitting constantly on the video. Thank you very much.
Volker, thank you very much. Sensible as ever. And what this has taught me today is really we're just at the beginning of something new to explore. And what I sincerely hope is that this report will form the basis of that, because this clearly isn't the end. We need to go on and have more progress. So with that in mind, I'm sorry we've overrun by a quarter of an hour, but as I said, we could have gone on for much longer. But thank you all very much, and the meeting is now closed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.